questions for our novel night authors tonight. It's, it's quite, yeah.
When did you go to Cuba?
Several years ago, I went to Cuba, and it was the same time that President Obama went. And I spent a long time riding buses all the way across the island.
Yeah.
Like 41 hours, and hitting all the cities. And collecting, the third night that I was there, I was in Cienfuegos in the plaza. I'd spent 2 nights in Havana, and it's Havana, it's what you think it is, it's the postcards, it's the cars, And I thought, oh, that's nice, so what's this island really about? So the third night we were in Cienfuegos, and I met this young man who asked us if we were interested in a restaurant, we were looking for a restaurant. And this kid was a dead ringer for Leonardo DiCaprio. Not only was he a dead ringer, he spoke English perfectly. No accent, just plain old American. And I, of course, leaped all over this for the moment and said, where are you from? He said, I'm from Cuba. I'm from Cienfuegos, and but I spent 3 years in high school in Newark, New Jersey. So he was with an uncle, because his mother couldn't handle him, because he was a rowdy teenager. And so we went to his uncle's place for dinner, and we sat for another 3 hours having beers and talking to him. And after that, I had my story, and fact and fiction began to separate. And so through my travels on the island, I didn't actually put the story together, but I read, I don't know if you're familiar with this, but it's Stephen King's book on writing. Yeah. And well, we love that, And so he said something to me in the book, and he said, the protagonist writes the story. And if you know who that protagonist is, he or she will write the story, because the voice is so strong. And that young man made such an incredible impact on me that I took him home with me. Weeks later, I lived with that kid in my head. He was so desperate to get off the island. He was just beside himself with desperation to leave Cuba. He couldn't stand it anymore. He's an accidental Cuban. He wasn't really born there. So he says, to me, he said, this isn't my country. I have no relationship to it. And it's a story about the disaffected youth in Havana, in Cuba. They're not communists. You can't find a communist there. You could look under every blanket, every bed, in every drawer, and you could never find a communist, a real one. That's all gone, but the government doesn't know it yet, or if they know it, they will not entertain it. So the backdrop is political for me, because I studied this a long time. In fact, I had a significant other who was involved in the Bay of Pigs, so I knew all that history, from stories and from his CIA work. And this is how I collected this story and worked with it. And then I got very up close and personal into the Cuban underground. And that's what really kind of ticked me. Yes,
What's the sequel to that?
Well, that's really interesting, because there is a sequel. How did you know that? He has the knowing. You have the knowing. I love that. When you get to the end of the book, you'll see it. I'll give the ending away if I tell you what the sequel is. Yes, Susan.
I'm just curious if you come in touch with that young man, and if he knows you wrote a book.
It was a moment.
Yeah.
And sometimes you just get your stories from the moment, and that's it. But it's such a strong. He was so strong in his intention, and then during the time we were there, Fidel dies. Obama had no more wet foot, dry foot. It turned the country upside down, so there wasn't any special circumstances for Cubans, and Mr. Trump became president and put the chokehold on this country. So it's a very, very difficult place to live. And they're so wonderful, and their music is so fabulous. And you could just see people outside the doors with the broom and dancing. They walk up in the hills of Santiago de Cuba, and it's like, magical.
Joy, can you talk about the origins of your story? Where it started?
It started when I got sick. I had a long-term illness for about 15 years, and I had to leave my work, which I loved, so I was sad. And I was sitting at my desk. We lived on an island in Washington State, and there was a playwrights festival coming up on the island where I lived, and I thought, well, I don't have anything to do because I'm useless and miserable, so I'll write a play. And this story came very quickly about the young girl with the knowings, and the message of the reason we are here on earth is to discover and give our gifts. And I felt that actually the story was a message to me that just because I was sick, I had no excuse, that it was my responsibility to find out what I could do, even with an illness. And so I became a volunteer for a long time. But that was the origin. I entered the play in the Playwrights Festival. It was just a 20-minute one act. And it was produced. It was one of the 6 winners of the festival. It was produced for the stage. And then it won the Audience Choice Award. And then later, the expanded manuscript was the winner of Young Adult Fiction, although I'm not convinced it is Young Adult Fiction, but for Writers League of Texas. So it had some life before it finally became a book. Thanks, Kathy.
So, Myra, who are some of the characters that are in this story that, how far back do these characters go? Do they go back to Steinhouse or the second novel?
Yes, some of the characters, both in Steinhouse and The Doctor's Wife, are in this book. They're just not right in the beginning of the book, but they do come. Steinhouse and Doctor's Wife is set in old Indianola, down on the Texas coast, where the Germans came in. And you probably know the history, that it finally blew away. Well, the first 2 books, Doctor's Wife and Steinhouse, cover that period of when they first arrived and lived actually in tents on just the Shell Beach, and then developed the seaport that became known as Indianola, a German seaport that thrived and rivaled Galveston before it was hit by the first hurricane in 1875, and then a final devastating hurricane hit in 86 and destroyed the town. In this book, some of the characters in that come here. This book actually ends in 1886 too, because as the Democrats began to fight to get back power that they lost during Reconstruction, the elections began to turn finally in Washington County, but it was unusual, more unusual than the other counties, for how long the freedmen worked to stay in control. They were like deputy sheriffs and meat inspectors and that kind of positions, never big positions in the county, but they did have responsible positions. And so finally in 1886, the vote finally was taken. And I even, in my wonderful research, found U.S. Congress committees. It was a report, and actually the people who were the witnesses from Washington County, there were about 50 of them that went to Washington to report on that election, and their testimony was in this thing that I found, and so I was able to use all of that information about what happened in that election to actually allow it to be lost completely by they were Republicans, but the Republicans were not just the blacks. There were some white leaders, and then the Germans who came into Washington County and bought land from the plantation owners who were land poor.
Is that why it's Bremen? It's Bremen.
No, that name was before they came.
Oh, before they came, because that's a city.
Well, no, it's called Brennan.
What is it? Bremen.
Brennan, but not Brennan.
Okay, all right.
Brennan is a German town,
Yeah.
the seaport where they came from.
I thought it was that.
But no, that name was before the Germans came. But they were part of the Republican Party, and so that's what helped keep the party going in the county. and the blacks worked so hard. But anyway, that's the whole arc of the story, and I was able to find that history as I was working on the story. I just wanted them to, because I had written Steinhouse and I'd written Doctor's Wife, I wanted to write about Washington County, and just lucked out in my research finding all this backstory that I was able to use.
Myra, we can't just give up these characters. I've read the other two books, and this one did. Are you gonna do another one to continue on?
I don't know. When I got a review by Kirkus Review, I couldn't believe the last line of the review said maybe I would consider doing the sequel. And I thought, people are going to get tired of these people.
We will know what happens.
Yeah. So I don't know if I will. Right now I'm not. I'm doing something else.
Are you up to 1900 yet?
Actually, I'm a modern day. This one I'm working on is a modern day story. It will be in Texas, of course, because I don't know anything but Texas. But it's going to be in Texas.
No, she's not. So that's. I got a question for all three of you. First of all, you're really impressive women. Thank you. Thank you for sharing your talents. My question for all three of you is, did you independently publish your work, or did you have publishers, or how did you go about that?
I guess I'm first. Well, after a very long and exhausting relationship with an agent, I thought I might die before I can get this published. And I had wrung out the story, you know, I mean, that was it. And all of this stuff this agent gave me, and the readers and this and that, I did what they suggested, and more editing, and then I said, I don't want to wait any longer. I don't want to be stuck in my life. So I self-published, and I got some very good advice from book people who told me who to publish with. There are two self-publishing platforms, not a hybrid. You know, you can use a hybrid, and you can pay for publishing. And so I just said, to heck with it, and I published on Ingram Spark. And I found it to be very easy, fruitful, and then it goes on Amazon, and then you work Amazon, and there are lots of ways to market digitally. And something else, well, one of my friends did a book on oh shoot, I always forget Henry Miller. Well, I don't know, I couldn't pull that one up. And he had his book published, and he said he did more darn work doing the marketing, and they didn't do anything for him. So I thought, well, if I'm going to do it myself, I'm going to do it myself. I did it, and I did it with my other book too. I did it with my memoir, and I just kind of fell into a pattern, and that's how it worked out. And I think it worked out great. And Joy gave me some pointers that a woman to go to, and another woman gave me a book guru, and I availed myself of people to talk to, and I thought, well, and the other thing was, so let's say this agent says, okay, we're done. Then she's got to get a publisher, and then they've got an editor on it. And I've heard so many horror stories of an editor getting into editing the book for the, I don't know, 100th time, and they would like certain things. So then you're redoing it again, and then we're into another year. And then another year to publish it. And I did really think I was going to die first. So that was and I would do it again the same way.
So I wrote 2 editions of a book prior to this, a nonfiction book that I co-wrote with my physician. And we went with a mainstream publisher for the first edition, and then that publisher was purchased by a British company, and they just pulled all the books. So it went out of print. So we did a second edition, and this time got an agent, went through the whole seeking the right house. And the agent was very effective. She got us into the right publishing house very quickly, but still, as you say, it's a 2-year ramp up from the time you have your manuscript ready to go before it goes to print. So when I wrote this book, I just had the exact same feeling. I just don't want to wait 2 years to see it get published and go through that whole process again of the agent and the publishing house. So There is a thing now called hybrid publishing where a woman I'm working with from the author's assistant provides a lot of the professional advice and formatting and marketing support. And then you publish, I did the hardback on Ingram and the Kindle and the paperback on Amazon. So I did all three formats. I would say the disadvantage or the advantage of going with a publishing house is distribution. Ingram will do some, but it's hard to get into bookstores, and also the marketing and reviews. A mainstream publishing house, they have those contacts to review the book, and you have to get that on your own, and that can be challenging. But I would agree that for the timeline and for the sharing of the revenue, I would probably self-publish again.
Thank you.
Well, I've been over the hump and back again. In the 80s, I wrote books that became guidebooks. They were just going to be stories people could go to a town and explore, and I discovered if I wanted to talk about some interesting site, like I can't even think the name of the town right now. Anyway, I had to give directions. People couldn't find these good sites. And so it ended up being a guidebook. And it was published by a local publisher, Aiken Press, who's now gone. And then University of Texas Press picked it up. And they published 3 of my books. And they took 2 years to get the book out. And they did not promote well. I mean, they would put it with some of the other things. But their royalty was just awful. And so then I had a period where I didn't write. And when I finally wrote a little book that I finished after I moved to Austin, I was reading one night in, I think it was Newsweek, that people had started using Create Space through Amazon to do their own books, but people who had gone to publishers and not gotten much royalty and all that, and I got so excited to stay awake all night. And so I got busy, and I had written this little book already before I ever came to Austin, so I got ready, and I did publish it in Create Space.
It's now called KEP.
And yeah, I know, I'm having trouble getting situated. But
Yeah,
anyway,
tell us something.
then I ended up trying with another publisher where you pay, which was awful. They're now selling my name to people, and they call me, so I do not recommend that. Finally, I ended up with a local publisher that's called Whitebird Publications. And she doesn't charge. She's very thorough. She has 3 editors. She wants you to have a professional editor before you take it to her, but then she sends it to 3 other editors who mainly take out and put in commas, I think. But it's not a long process. And she pays her royalties every month, which is nice. And so I've been with her for the last 2 books, and I will probably stay with her a while. There was one other publisher I used who does beautiful books, but he's a lousy businessman, so I won't use him. I've had 10 books published, so I have an assortment of complaints.
Lots of experience.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for this evening.